In this next video, we are going to look at something called ngFor. Now, ngFor also uses an asterisk like we saw with ngIf, so you can assume that we're already going to be using some form of template that may be used or repeated. So let's have a walk through this code really quickly. Now, I'm going to create some form of airline passengers list, and we're going to use ngFor to iterate over these passengers and basically print them out one by one using our template inside a list. Now, the interesting thing is we have a public property called passengers. So instantly we can access the passengers, and we can do something like passengers.length, which will give us the array length in the actual template. One thing that we're going to do is introduce you to some more TypeScript. So you can see I have this word any. Now, if I remove this, TypeScript actually complains at me because it expects a type. I could get rid of this by doing this. However, we want to do things properly. So we're going to create a type called passenger, which essentially matches the keys of each of these objects. Now, obviously, this is an array of passengers, so it's going to be passenger array. It's underlined in red because it cannot find the name of passenger. So what we're going to do first is actually create an interface based off of these. So each passenger has an ID, a full name, and they are checked in, true or false. For instance, this one's false. True, true, and false, and each of them has a unique ID. So to do this and create our own type, we essentially create something called an interface. So we can do interface and then passenger, and this is basically a virtual object that describes what these passengers look like. Now, each of them has an ID, a full name, which is a string, the ID is a number, checked in is then a Boolean. So we can go up here and say ID is going to be a number, full name is going to be a string, and then the checked in is going to be a Boolean. So this is essentially a descriptor of our object, and you can see that there are no red underlines here. However, if we converted this to perhaps a string, you would see this big red underline, and it would give us an error message saying that the string is not actually of the correct type. So TypeScript is really helpful when we're actually dealing with data sets such as passengers and an array. So here's our first interface. If you haven't used TypeScript before, we've got an ID, full name checked in. We can add another property to this, such we'll just call it prop, and we'll call it false. And you can see that this is now red underlined because this doesn't exist in our interface. So these are really good for handling and managing your data. So the first thing we want to do is actually list our airline passengers out. So to do this, what we'll do is create a unordered list. Now inside this list, we're going to create an li, and then we're going to close it off. Now already you can start to imagine that we're going to render out our passengers somewhere in here. So we want to create a list item with Angular for every single passenger. Now again, we want to treat this as a template element like we saw in the ngIf video. So what we do is ngFor with the asterisk. And now what we do is do let, so this creates a local variable called passenger. So we do let passenger, and then we do of passengers. Now this might look familiar to you if you've been using JavaScript. So this is basically a for of loop. So essentially inside of here, we have access to each individual passenger. So we could in fact wrap this inside a curly brace, and we can quickly go and check this out in the browser. So you can see that we have airline passengers. We obviously have 5 passengers in our flight today, and we have all 5 objects that have been printed out to the DOM. Now, obviously, we want to display the individual keys. So let's go back and actually make this work properly with the ngFor. So looking back at our passengers array, we have an ID, a full name, and checked in or true or false. So what we're going to do is just simply do .full name. So this is just looking up the object property on that particular passenger. When we go back to the browser, you can see that all of our names have been rendered out correctly. Now, sometimes we might want to create some kind of click event inside of here where we want to know the particular index of the person. So let's assume that we want to put the index here and actually just list out in numerical order the index of the passenger. So obviously this is an array, so the index is going to start from 0, so we'll have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 in our passengers. The way that we can get the index is by creating another variable here. So we can do let I, which the I corresponds to this one. We can call it whatever we want, and we just do equals index. So index is exposed to us via Angular, and we can call it I. So we're just simply referencing this variable locally, and inside the template, we then pick up this I. So let's go and have a look at this. And there you go, you can see that we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Just like before with the ngIf video, we're going to show how this expands to a template element or a web component. So what I'm going to do is duplicate this entire block and paste it again. We're going to keep this heading here just so you can divide the two lists. Now, if you imagine that we can wrap this entire list node inside a template tag, and we'll indent these accordingly. So the template will then essentially wrap this li, which is why we don't see all these ngFors and all this information in the DOM if you want to inspect element. So what this will basically expand to is an ngFor, and the way that it creates this local variable called passenger, it basically does let and then a dash and then passenger, and this will basically be driven from the list of passengers, which we'll explain momentarily. Now we also have the index, so this will do let dash I. So then we need to pass it that index because the index is exposed here via Angular, whereas we're passing our own passengers array in. So the way that we actually do the passengers array is we use this ngFor of. So, and then we just do equal passengers. So that's exactly what's happening when we use this syntax. It treats it as a template element and it creates all this stuff under the hood for you. And this gives you full encapsulation if we want to. We can use Shadow DOM. You can look at how you can use Shadow DOM in the Angular docs on the view encapsulation, and we'll also be covering it in the Angular Pro course on a much more advanced component usage with the view encapsulation. So this essentially is the expanded version of the li ngFor of what Angular's compiler will translate it into. So we'll save this out and then we'll go back to the browser and actually check this out. So you can see here we have airline passengers and the dividing airline passengers, and we have the identical objects in every single one. So hopefully in this lesson you've learned how to iterate a collection of data, which is probably what you'll be doing most in your applications, and by using ngFor and understanding why the syntax is there gives you an understanding of why we're using an asterisk with an ngFor and an ngIf.